ask myself when I prepare a session is, who am I intending this session for? As you probably have seen in the title, we have a lot of technical terms. We're talking about the SharePoint Framework, the Microsoft Graph, Azure Functions. Those are mostly dev notions, right? So, of course, this session is mostly going to be oriented towards developers or DevOps engineers, as the trendy word to say today. But also, it will be interesting content for deciders or architects or people that want to know how things can be built and what are the new architectural patterns and design patterns, basically. Usually, when I give a session in person, this has been a long time since I have not given a session in person and remotely. But usually, I ask for a show of hand how many developers we have in the room, how many IT pros, how many deciders. So I'll trust that I get approximately, like usually, a third and a third and a third of developers, IT pros, and deciders. So today's agenda. We will briefly talk about the new stack for the SharePoint Framework. I trust that most of you have heard about the basic concepts for the SharePoint Framework and are at least a little bit familiar about the SharePoint Framework, but we'll make some recap to make sure we're all on the same page. Then we'll talk about Azure Functions. They're not very new. It's been 2 years they're around, at least publicly available. And Microsoft released the V2 in general availability last October, I want to say. So there are a few new concepts that have been introduced, but it's important to understand why those are a game changer for developers and why they help us deliver much more value faster to the company. We'll talk about Azure Active Directory and ADAL, MSAL, authentication, authorization, and so on and so forth. Basic concepts that you need to understand to a level good enough so you can implement what you want to implement and access the data you want to access, and so on and so forth. Of course, we'll talk about the Microsoft Graph and what it is, what kind of API, what does it provide, and so on and so forth. And we'll see a demonstration about all of that playing together during this session. And at the end, it will be time to reach a conclusion and to say goodbye. So Julie told me that I have until midnight. I can keep you until midnight to the meetup. No, maybe. It's hard to make jokes remotely. But no, this is a pretty packed session. But the way I like to have my sessions is I like that to be interactive. So I know the fact that I'm speaking remotely will be challenging for that. So I trust that Julie will be able to relay on the chat the questions or any remarks or anything like that. So this way I can kind of answer them on the fly. And I might be asking questions to you as well during the session. With that, let's go. So we'll start by the demonstration because the demonstration is always more interesting. The first time I gave that session was in the SharePoint Fest, Washington, D.C. It was almost a year ago now for the first version of that session, at least. And it was my first time in Washington, D.C. And at the same time, I was also watching the new season of Homeland, which is for those of you that don't know about it, about a CIA agent that saves the world a couple of times and is a bit special and so on and so forth. Anyways, I needed to come up with a new scenario and a new demonstration for that session. So I created a fake agency for Canada, the CIA, that stands for Canada Immersion Agency, or Canada Incredible Agency, or Canada whatever agency, as you can understand. And the goal of this agency is to make sure that everyone will be nice and will have nice interactions between one another. Make sure you send nice emails and make sure that you're polite and all those kind of things. This is the goal of that super secret government agency here. So as I said, we want to encourage people to have better interactions with one another. For that, we're going to scan their emails and analyze the content. And we'll do something called sentiment analysis and score the sentiment. That's not something you need to understand right now, but basically what it means is we will have some automated machine learning, reading the text of the email and checking whether it's a positive email or a negative email, meaning is it nice or a mean email, basically. And that will give us a number that then we can process and do things with. And we will display the average score per user on the company portal, leveraging SharePoint Framework web part. So it's demo time. Let me drag the proper window over here. All right, for that demonstration, I will ask for your participation here. I hope this is big enough on your screen. You can see that I put an email address here. And what is important is not the title of the email, but the body of the email. So we don't care about the title. We care more about the body of the email. And say either something super nice or something super bad, saying, hey, I love this session, this is awesome, or hey, I hate this session, you have a weird accent, or anything like that. And it is important, it's in the body when you send those emails. So I'll give you a couple of minutes to send those emails. And if you can raise your hand once you've sent the email, and Julie, once we have five people that have sent the emails, if you can let me know on the chat, so this way I can refresh the information. And what you have to notice here is currently, because the system has not been initialized and we don't have any data, it's showing 0% of niceness. So it means we're super bad, basically. And when we'll refresh the data, we'll see the progress bar changing according to what you guys are sending to me. All right, I trust that people are sending emails. Maybe I should open my inbox, actually. Let me go there. No, I don't want the admin center. Cancel. Look. I don't want to try the new Outlook. Thank you. So. No subject, but an awesome idea. Thank you, Julie. You guys are working on it. Are you too busy with a pizza, I guess? Please put email. Yeah, I'll put the email address back here. It's going to be easier for you. I'm going to move that out of the way. Thank you, Mike, for letting me. All right, so let's see. Only one. All right, I'll keep going. So if I refresh my data, I should see, once this request comes in, we only have the email from Julie, which is the content was, what an awesome idea. Of course, it's a positive email. Thank you, Julie. So that means I get 90% of being nice, 98% of being nice. We just got a new email from Jim. Thank you, Jim. Let's refresh again. So 98%. Oh no, all the emails are coming in. All right, come on, refresh. So what do we have? Great session. Hi. All right, thank you guys. All right, so it's still processing in the backend. We'll come refresh that later on. So now I'm going to explain to you how I built that and how you can actually use the same concepts, not to scan everybody's emails in the company, because of course that's going to make people uncomfortable, but build a line of business solutions in a matter of minutes, basically. So the way this solution is built is we first have users here, these big black user. And of course, they're using Office 365, so their emails are in Exchange Online here. So the first thing that's going to happen is the users, they send and receive emails every day. When that happens, what you have to understand about the graph, and we'll deep dive in the graph later on, is the graph doesn't store any data itself for the major part. The graph is just an API, a proxy API to all the other workloads in Office 365. So whenever an email comes in Exchange is going to notify the Microsoft Graph that something has changed. What's going to happen then is, because I registered something called a webhook, and I'll detail later what webhook is, the graph is going to let me know, let my Azure function know, hey, something new came in. You might want to look at that and check what's the new information and so on. Because so here on the right side, you can see that I actually have two functions with a little envelope. One thing very important to remember about webhooks, and this is not limited to the graph, this is not limited to a specific Microsoft API or anything like that. Webhooks are meant to be very fast to execute, because otherwise the system that notifies you and sends you this notification might start penalizing you if you start failing or taking too much time, because on their end it takes them more time, more processing power, and so on and so forth to retry. So you want to make sure you have on the code that receives the notification, you have as little logic as possible. So this way you're as fail-safe as possible, and also you're as fast as possible. So what I'm doing here is I'm effectively using a first function to just get the notification and queue that notification saying, hey, we got something, we need to take care of it, but let's do that later. So this way we can reply as fast as possible to the graph. Hey, okay, I got that notification, thank you, bye-bye. And then the other function here is going to pick it up, do the analysis process, and then treat the data and so on and so forth, and treat the message. So then what happens is the user logs into the SharePoint corporate portal with all the web parts, including our custom web part. And that web part, which is built with the SharePoint Framework, which leverages a bunch of capabilities of the SharePoint Framework, contacts our Azure function to get custom line of business logic executed. Here, a basic average with all the scores, and displays that information for the user. This is basically how this solution works, and this is a common pattern that you can implement for any line of business solution. Before I dive into the new stack, I'll just make sure I'll double check the chat if we have any questions. 1, 2. Julie, no questions so far on the architecture or anything like that on your side? Nope. All right, I'll keep going then. Thank you, Julie. So let's talk about the first piece of that solution. Let's talk about the SharePoint Framework. So you should all be familiar with the SharePoint Framework, but I'll just make sure we have the same common understanding. So the idea of the SharePoint Framework, when they introduced it publicly 3 years ago and privately to the MVPs 4 years ago, was to kind of reboot and reinvent the SharePoint extensibility model to provide us with more modern approaches, more approaches that are easier, faster to develop, and are more common with what we see on the web development today and what we used to see on the web development at least 4 years ago. So that means the first thing, new tools. You will use Node.js, which is basically the way to run JavaScript outside of a browser. So Node.js is only what it does, right? It only runs JavaScript locally in your machine without without a browser open. And because we have that capability, we're able to implement a lot of different things based on Node.js. Some build web applications, meaning backend applications, and they use that as a web server, but we can also use it for our tooling to automate a few tasks, to help us transpile the code, and so on and so forth. Of course, when you start a project, you don't want to reinvent the wheel, have this redevelop this date picker widget or anything like that, and you will most likely rely on libraries. And there is a tool / an ecosystem that's called NPM for Node Package Management, which is basically the equivalent of what NuGet is for .NET. So it's an ability to package libraries and distribute them and install them in your project to make sure that you can pull a date picker, you can pull a way to do HTTP request, you can pull lots of different things. Part of the ecosystem we get also when we start a new SharePoint Framework project is Gulp. So Gulp is a way to automate tasks. It is a task, not scheduler, but a task runner that will help you do things like transpile your code. So going from the code you write to the code that the browser can understand, doing things like packaging your application, doing things like deploying your application, and so on and so forth. I was talking about code, and as the SharePoint developers, our language of choice used to be C#. Some of us used to be doing VB.NET, but that's okay. But yeah, our language of choice used to be C#. The equivalent today for that new stack is TypeScript. And if you're not very familiar with JavaScript development, I think this is okay. And I would encourage you, if you're starting to learn web front-end development and modern development and so on and so forth, and you're coming from, like I was coming from like a couple of years ago, a .NET background, and you're a little bit confused because JavaScript itself is dynamic, so it doesn't have the same constraints and same thinking that static types programming languages might have, and it can be super confusing if you come from a .NET background. So what you have to understand is TypeScript is only a superset on top of JavaScript, so it can do everything that JavaScript can do and more things like type checking, like a lot of other things like generic types and so on and so forth that you're used to in .NET. And that comes with a set of tools, with TypeScript compiler, with a linter, and so on and so forth, that help you have an experience which is the same or almost better than .NET development. So what my advice here would be, if you're starting to learn modern front-end development and you are super confused by JavaScript, don't learn JavaScript. Learn TypeScript to begin with, because TypeScript is going to make your life easier. And then dive in JavaScript, because at some point when you debug and you deep dive in some complex bugs, you need to understand what's under the covers. But at the very beginning, you can only learn TypeScript and focus on that, and it's going to be much less confusing, and it's going to help you set a foot in the front-end dev world. The next tool we can see is the little guy with a little hat, which is called Yeoman. So traditionally, when we wanted to start a new project for SharePoint development, we would go to Visual Studio, the full-fledged version, and go to File, New Project, select a SharePoint project, and that will walk us through what kind of project, a bunch of questions, and start creating all the project structure with all the files we needed to, well, have our project meeting, basically. The equivalent, one of the equivalents of that in the front-end development world is Yeoman. So Yeoman is a tool that runs on the command line, and that will help you create new projects for SharePoint, but also for React, for Angular has its own CLI, so that's different, but for lots of different front-end frameworks and project types. So the way it works is you do yo at Microsoft/SharePoint or yo at PNP/SPFX, and it will ask you a bunch of questions like, what kind of project do you want? How do you want to name it? Do you want a web part, an extension, and so on and so forth? And this is how this is going to work. Lastly, on our new tools, we have now the choice of the IDE. Previously, we had to use Visual Studio, the full-fledged version, to do SharePoint development. Now we can use something like I'm going to be showing today, Visual Studio Code, or the full Visual Studio version, or Sublime, or WebStorm, or a bunch of other IDEs out there. The great thing about that is this whole ecosystem is also cross-platform. So that means if you are on Windows, you can do SharePoint development, but if you're on Linux or Mac, you can also do SharePoint development. It also means you don't need SharePoint installed locally anymore to do SharePoint development. As I said it many times, the SharePoint framework today is front-end only. So everything, all the code you'll be writing is going to be running on the front-end, running in the browser, and that brings a bunch of considerations, and sometimes it can bring limitations. But the good news about that is it has a much smaller footprint, it's much faster to execute, as well as it does not jeopardize the server or the services on the backend like we used to be doing with traditional models. Meaning that if I wrote bad code with a full trust model, and if that code will crash the server, it will impact everyone and anyone on the farm. When if here I write bad code with SharePoint Framework solutions, well, only my solution is not going to be working, and it's not going to be working for the users using it or trying to use it, not the other users that don't care about my solution or are doing totally different things. Another great news is we have two things called the local and the remote workbench. So those for the local workbench is something that looks like SharePoint but is not SharePoint, and that will allow you to run stuff locally and try things like is the CSS rendering properly, the look and feel, and so on and so forth, and try very trivial code. And the remote workbench is the same version of that, but hosted by SharePoint, not locally. So you need to have some kind of internet connection or some connectivity to SharePoint, but that will help you to test it out in a SharePoint context. So having access to an actual SharePoint context, having access to SharePoint lists and libraries and more things like that. Again, this is really great because we don't need this heavy SharePoint developer laptop that we use to carry way back then, because we needed to run SharePoint locally. So my back is very happy about that. I don't need to carry that around anymore. The SharePoint framework itself is closed source because there are bits running in SharePoint in the product or service, and there are bits running in the browser. But it's relying on a lot of open source tools like Node, NPM, TypeScript, Gulp, Yeoman, and so on and so forth. The great news about that is the open source community has much more documentation, samples, support, forum, people, and so on and so forth than we used to have in the traditional backend development model for SharePoint. So what it means is you'll find more information. It's going to be easier to learn stuff, and as well as if you're like a team lead or an architect or a manager, well, you can now imagine people that have little knowledge about SharePoint helping your team to build SharePoint extensions or SharePoint customizations. The barrier to entry to SharePoint development is much lower now with SharePoint Framework than it used to be a couple of years ago. And lastly, the promise we got from Microsoft is, when we came out with that, is that it is a first and third party API, extensibility model. What it means is when they're building SharePoint product, SharePoint Online, SharePoint 2016, SharePoint 2019, and they are building the modern experience, they are using the SharePoint framework behind the scenes. So they have the biggest interest to have a good framework that works well, that has a lot of documentation, a lot of support, and so on and so forth. And we cannot do any magic trick that we used to see back in the days, where they could do something that we could not do because they had access to hidden APIs in the product that we didn't have access to. So what it means is our experience as third-party developers, whether you work at a consulting company or at an end customer or at a product company, which is not Microsoft, should be much better than it used to be with the backend models. What's new, or I kind of tried to recap some news that came out the last, I would say, 6 months now. is the SharePoint Framework. So they iterate every 2 months. They came out on average, right? It's not a promise. Like don't quote me on that. But the way the SharePoint Framework is developed is every two. It's developed for SharePoint Online first. So that means that Microsoft can update the things supporting the SharePoint Framework in SharePoint on a regular basis because it's SharePoint Online and they own the service and so on and so forth. And what it means is we can also ship updates for the SharePoint Framework on a regular basis. So every 2 months, usually we get a new version of a SharePoint Framework that either brings preview capabilities into GA or brings new capabilities in preview. And over the last few months, we got a few capabilities. We have the ability from the SharePoint Framework to access custom web APIs that we build ourselves, or the Microsoft Graph. And the SharePoint Framework and SharePoint itself are going to bake in things like authentication and authorization, and get us all the token, do all the token dances and so on and so forth. So this way we have a client ready to use. As I said, we can request additional scopes and permissions. So this way we can have access to more or less things. It bakes in the authentication, and those are still available. Admins, so the great thing about that is we thought about developers by giving them access to lots of things, but admins still are in controls because they have a way to approve or deny permission requests. So we still know, okay, that SharePoint solution is using this specific permission or requesting for that specific permission. Yes, I'm comfortable with that because I know the developers and I trust the developers that are building that solution. Or no, I'm not comfortable with that. I'm going to either investigate or deny that request. And that we're gonna skip because I'm going to show it to you right now. So if I move this over that, so I have a question from Russell, who is asking, where is the data stored? What data are you referring to before diving into the demonstration? And yeah, go ahead. The data that's stored as the email. I'll get back to that specific point when I dive into the function specifically. But thank you for bringing that up. All right. So before I begin, Julie, can you tell me if this is big enough for you guys on the screen? And do you prefer a black theme, or a white or a light theme? Dark or light? I don't know how we call those, but black is fine, and you're good. Thank you very much. All right, so here, let me just start zoom it so we can. There we go. So here is my. Does it zoom as well on the team screen sharing, or is it zooming only for me? It zoomed. Thank you very much. All right, so here is my typical SharePoint Framework project. So I went through Yeoman and I say, yo, at Microsoft SharePoint, I want a new project. I said I want a new web part and I want to name it this, and that. So every time you scaffold a new SharePoint Framework project, it's more or less going to look the same. You're going to have a bunch of configuration files here, exactly. So things that dictate how the quality standard of your code. Here dictates the configuration for compiling. Here dictates all the packages you might have. This is what's displaying here on the right. So you can see that my solution is using, for example, Office UI Fabric React to use very well and polished controls and components to do things like buttons, to do things like progress bars and so on and so forth. So this way I don't have to redevelop those myself and they look like SharePoint itself. You also have a GULB file here that defines all the tasks for compiling, bundling, and so on and so forth. And you have things like traditional editor configuration. This is not the most interesting part. If you dive into configuration here, you will see an additional set of configuration files that dictate what's going to happen when you serve your solution, what's your how you're gonna package your solution, and so on and so forth. So if I look into this one. One interesting thing we can see here, as you can see, my solution is talking to my custom API, and it's talking to the graph as well, my SharePoint Framework solution. So this is how you can set this up. In the package solution, you can either request for the Microsoft Graph and have access to different type of resources and type of permissions. So here for the graph, I'm asking for mail.read. The reason why I'm asking for mail.read is because I'm registering my webhooks from the front-end piece. So I need to have that permission to be able to register my webhooks. And the second one you see here is an API request, permission request for my custom API. So we here are asking two permission requests for two different APIs, one being the Microsoft Graph and the other one being my custom API that I'm going to show you in the functions side of things. The other part of that is my web part here is a standard web part. Nothing very interesting here. I'm just relying on my nice service here to pull the data. And that nice service, if I show it, come on code, I don't know why code is hanging. Where is it? Component data, nice service. All right, let's go manually. So as you can see here, I have two methods. The first one being here, register webhook. So the way that works is from the web part context, thanks to the SharePoint Framework and thanks to the declaration I made earlier, I will have access to, that's the web part context, to the Microsoft Graph client factory, and I can do .getClient. So of course this is this returns a promise, so I'm using async await to make the code simpler to read and faster to execute. And then the second thing I'm using here is this is the typical body payload to declare a webhook. So I'm saying to Microsoft Graph, hey, I'm interested in new emails that are coming in for the current user, and this is the URL of my endpoint that you can notify once you get a new email. And the way then I register that specific, I send out over that specific payload is I use my graph client I just got here. So here I go to on the API /subscriptions and I post my payload. And just in 8 lines of codes here, I'm able to register a webhook. This is very simple. Other method here that's going to be interesting is this one. Same kind of logic here. I'm going to use the web part context to use the AAD HTTP client factory this time. It's a different one. And I'll say, hey, I want the client for this specific application, and that's going to be the application ID I registered for my function. Once I do that, same idea, because I'm sending, I'm actually doing a get, yes, a get request here. You can see that I'm using that client to send over a request to my custom Azure function with a bunch of settings, and then I get the return payload as a JSON, and then I can that contains my my information, my nice score for the user, and I can return it. So this is how I get that specific data. Any questions on that piece of code, those pieces of code so far? Once, twice. All right. So now when I looks awesome. Thank you, Julie. So now when I do my deployment, it's going to require two things. So first I need to package my application and upload it into the, I have a bunch of those, into the, it's somewhere here, I swear. Hold on a sec. Is it nice, maybe? Here, it's this one. No, it's not the DevOps one, presence, graph, creation. Yeah, this is this one. So I'm going to upload my package here to make the solution and the web part available to all my websites. And when I do that, it's going to do another thing in the background. It is going to, if I go here to the admin center and to the modern SharePoint admin center, I have a new tab here, which is called under Advanced API Management. So anytime a new solution is uploaded to the app catalog and requests access to different APIs, so remember here in the package solution, anytime a solution contains anything like that, it's going to be uploaded to the app catalog. It is going to be creating entries here saying, hey, that specific solution, if I click on that, if I click on information, that specific solution requested for this specific permission. Are you okay with that? And you can approve or reject. They're still working on polishing that UI, so you might have some kind of weird experience here at this point. But for like the happy path works well. Sometimes when you do subsequent deployments and so on, it might be acting a little bit on you, but the happy path works well. So here we can see that I already approved my permissions, one for my custom function here, and one for the Microsoft Graph mail not read, and here SharePoint Framework graph functions, user impersonation that are deployed here. And so, yeah, this is all it takes from the SharePoint Framework's perspective to be able to talk to the graph or to be able to talk to your custom API. I'm going to jump back to the slide deck and talk about Azure Functions now. So let's talk about Azure Functions. And before we talk about Azure Functions, we need to talk about serverless. A decade ago now, it used to take a very long time to provision a new application. Not only we had to take care about writing the code, but we also had to take care of writing specification for a server or a bunch of servers to be able to run our code. Procurement had to go buy the servers, install the OS, rack everything, provide electricity and network and a bunch of things like that, deploy our code there, and maybe 2 months down the road, our application will be deployed. Then came something that helped us a little bit, which was virtualization. So IT would maintain those big farms that are virtualization farms, and when we needed the new virtual machine to run a new application, we would say, okay, I need a virtual machine this big, can you give it to me? And hopefully they would say yes, and you'll be able to deploy that application. So that reduced a little bit the time to deploy an application and the time to market for an application, but it was still complex and still complicated. IT being overloaded most of the time in most organizations with all the requests from the users, from the developers, and so on and so forth, and the internet connectivity being better and better and better. The following logical evolution of that, of virtualization, was the cloud. So instead of asking IT to, because the core business of my company is not being a web hosting company, it's to be doing its core business that it's doing, either if it's selling potatoes, it's selling potatoes, right? So we relied on cloud provider and hosting companies to do that for us, and we would, with a self-service provisioning flow and aspect, we would be able to request new VM and pay for those as we use those, right? But still, we need to care about how many VMs, how big are the VMs, I need to patch the OS, and so on and so forth. So longer down that path came out the kind of a SaaS, a PaaS solution. So that was IaaS, infrastructure as a service, to have VMs and those kind of things, and we need to patch and maintain. And PaaS is more like platform as a service. It's a bit higher, and you'll not be taking care of, I want a server that big or a VM that big, but it's more like, I want to be having a database that big, or a web application that big, and so on and so forth, right? So it abstracts a bunch of concepts from you, and it allows you to focus on what matters the most, the line of business logic. But still, you needed to care about the size of a service and a bunch of other things like that. And it was not very convenient. It could take time to configure all those things. So the serverless, the idea of that is to abstract everything away, abstract the notion of servers or service or anything like that. And one of the key premises of that is that you want to have instant driven scale. If you need to handle 10 requests a second for 1 minute, and the following minute 100,000 requests a second, well, it's perfectly fine. The service that's hosting you is going to take care of that for you, and you just need to care about the code you're writing. And associated to that, well, we want sub-second billing. If I'm using 10 seconds or 10 requests a second computing power, I want to be billed just for that specific time. And then when I'm using 100,000 requests a second, I want to be billed for that, just for that amount of time. I don't want to have things like, hey, but you reserve the capacity for an hour, or you started using it for the hour, so we will charge you the full hour, or anything like that. Like all the telecom minutes for cell phones way back then. No. So those are the kind of pillar definitions of a serverless movement. It brings a bunch of benefits. First, it's much easier to do DevOps because you only take care of deploying your code and basically you're done, right? So if you can set up CI/CD, one of my other favorite subjects, you're basically good to go. And it allows you to focus again on business logic because you don't need to care about so many things. Well, you have more time to focus on business logic and to provide either more value to the user and to the company, or to spend less time building something. And well, all of that means that on average, for any kind of value you need to ship to your customers or your users, well, this reduces the time to market a lot. So Azure Functions are basically Microsoft's answer to the market. Amazon has Amazon Lambdas. Google has, I don't remember the name right now, but they have something as well. And Azure Functions are one of the, the answer to Microsoft, from Microsoft to that market specifically. So the way Azure Functions work, you start by picking a language. You pick a trigger, so what's going to start your function. You add some input/output, so a way to get data or write data, read data or write data if you want, to some extent. And then you, focus on writing your line of business logic code, so what actually matters to you. Hopefully you test it before you deploy it, and you deploy your code. And if you want, you can scale and tweak the scale of your service and the billing model, and I will extend on that a little bit later on. And you're ready to ship to production. So in 7 steps, in 10 minutes maybe, you're able to go from I don't have any backend service to I have a new backend service that's ready for production, that handles scalability, that handles authentication, authorization, and a bunch of other things like that. When I talk about connectors, those are some of the connectors that are available. And connectors are going to provide you with new triggers, new inputs and outputs, so ways to start your function, ways to go read data or receive data, or ways to go write data or send data. Things like the Azure Blob Storage, Azure Cosmos DB, the Event Hub or the IoT Hub. Of course, Azure Functions can be triggered via HTTP requests, things like webhooks or pure post requests or GET requests, and so on and so forth. SendGrid for sending emails. The Microsoft Graph has a connector that's still in preview, but is available for Azure Functions. The Service Bus and Twilio, the last one on the right with the round and the dots, to be able to send text messages. When I talk about languages, all those languages are available today, but only those ones are available in for production workloads, which are C#.NET, JavaScript, and TypeScript if you transpile it down to JavaScript, and F# in .NET as well. The other ones are still in preview, so you can use it. Just don't expect production support for that. The way this works in terms of billing, because this is a question I usually get, is you can either, so if I back up a little bit, Azure Functions are built on the foundation of Azure App Services, that are the web hosting solution of Azure that have been around for at least 5 or 6 years at least. That's a strong foundation. You can go crazy with that and implement crazy workloads on that. It will work, so that's not a problem. Because they are built on Azure App Services, if you want to tweak your billing and the way you will be charged, you can leverage app service plans, because you're telling to Microsoft, I want to reserve this much capacity, and they bill you for the capacity you're reserving and using, and that's easier for them because they don't have to absorb the risk of capacity going crazy, basically. The other one, which is the easiest one, which is the careless one, is a consumption-based plan. So basically, you just ship your code and say, all right, build me for what I'm using, and that will be counted with gigabyte per second. They have a math formula that's in the slides as well, and that's the easiest one. Usually, what I recommend to my customers or to people that are learning Azure Functions is start with a consumption-based plan. Look at what you need, and don't make wild guess. Well, that don't mean anything. Just ship it to production. Start off a consumption-based plan. Look at what you need in terms of memory, CPU, and so on and so forth, based on the experience on the field. And once you have done that, switch back to an app service plan. If your workload is kind of constant or fairly constant, because this way it's going to be a bit cheaper than the consumption-based plan. So in terms of tooling, we can of course use the full-fledged Visual Studio version with the Azure SDK, or we can use the Azure Functions SDK and CLI with Visual Studio Code or any editor. We also have an editing experience right within the portal, the Azure portal. So if you don't have any tools, if you're on let's say an iPad, because you cannot install much things on an iPad, and you want to prototype something and build an API really quick, you can still go to a portal, write some code, and have it live to test something, right? So that's really good. But of course, as developers who like more comprehensive experiences, so you have access to those options as well. And let's jump to the demo. So, all right, still no questions so far. I'll keep going. Let me move Visual Studio here. All right. So here I have, as I mentioned earlier, I have, so even for a smaller app, an app service plan can be cheaper than consumption. So that's a question from Russell. Thank you very much for the question. No, there is it's it's like a stair, right? There is a certain amount of processing power under which the consumption plan will be much cheaper than anything, especially for things that are not like that are executed maybe once a week or once a day or something like that, that don't have a consistent workload. The consumption plan is going to be much cheaper in that case. If you have something that is executing every, let's say, 5 minutes or 10 minutes and using a decent amount of CPU or memory, and that's a bit constant in terms of workloads, or that you can multiply in scale units of a service plan, it's cheaper to go with a service plan. And that's something, again, rather than doing wild guesses and so on, I encourage people to go with a consumption one, and after that, identify what you need and switch to a service plan, an app service plan, and hopefully it should be cheaper. If it's not the case, well, revert back to a consumption plan, right? But thank you for the question. So here, if we look in Visual Studio, I have two projects, as I mentioned. I have the webhook one and the function one. Again, the webhook, why is it separated? Because the webhook, we want to have the least logic possible, and we just want it to get the notification, put it in service bus, and finish. And also because this one is going to be secured via authentication and authorization, and this one is going to be unsecured because the graph needs to be able to make a public call to that. It doesn't authenticate to your webhook for performance reasons. So if we start here, anytime an email is going to come, I'm going to zoom on that. You can see that my function is triggered with an HTTP trigger, and I have two things. First, when you're building a webhook for the Microsoft Graph, it's going to send you a validation key. So At the time you register that webhook, the code I had in the front-end application that was saying, hey, I need to register to the emails, the graph is going to poke your webhook to make sure it is alive and it is yours, because you could be using the graph to DDoS other services. So it's going to send you a request with a validation key, with a validation token in the query, and you need to reply to that saying, hey, just 200 OK, text plain with the same validation key, so they know that it's your webhook and not another service you're trying to DDoS thanks to their service. And that pattern is fairly common across the webhook methodology. It's not limited to the graph. So that's the first use case here. The second one is this one. So here, anytime I get a new notification of one or many new emails coming in, what I do is I read the body of the notification, which doesn't contain the body of the email, but I just read the body of a notification and I add it to the queue automatically, the service bus queue. How do I do that? I have a service bus input here that's leveraging the email queue with that service bus connection and so on. So, and gives me that already baked in for me, like all the, connecting to the service bus, having a client and so on and so forth. All that is already ready for me. I just need to use that parameter and add things in there if I want to send messages in that queue. That's all I need to do. So that's for the webhook. And again, it's not, it doesn't have any kind of authentication because the graph is going to ping me publicly. So then the second part is on that other function project. And I have the first function, which is called score email. So here it's going to trigger on a service bus message. So the same service bus that we were writing to just before, it's going to react on messages that are coming into that queue. It's going to give me right away the text of a notification as a string. And with that, I can deserialize the object. And then what I can do is I can get a graph client, and I'll explain that later on, and use the graph SDK with my client to say, okay, I want the user from the notification ID, and then I want his or her messages. I want to request that. And based on this, so that's for each message ID I get in the notification, right? This is why I have a for each. So I want to get the content of each message, and then I want to score it. So let's dive in scoring it, because we had a question from, I believe it was Russell earlier. So that's not the core part of the session, but I'm using cognitive services, Azure Cognitive Services, which is a bunch of ready-to-go machine learning processes and machine learning APIs that are ready to use. And here I'm just saying, okay, I have this text content. Please give me the sentiment score. So it's an API basically where I send text and it gives me, is it a positive or a negative text, right? And I do that for each and every email I get. So I do that. And then the second thing I do here is I use, so once I have my score here, I save that score because I need to retain it somewhere for each email. So later on, when my web part tries to get that score, I need to store it somewhere, right? And I don't want to build a database or anything crazy. Well, one of the other great things about the Microsoft Graph is the open extensions. So it's a way for you to be able to save on certain objects, additional properties that you'll be able to read and retrieve and so on and so forth. And that's the only thing that is effectively stored in the graph. All the rest of the data, it is stored in the different services. So here I'm saying, hey, here's my open extension, Microsoft Graph.open extension. Here's the name. So my Twitter handle .happy because this is my solution. And yeah, the data it's going to have is the score. So the score value I got from the sentiment analysis. This is what I'm going to store. And here I'm again using the Graph SDK. I'm using that to save it to the message object. So on each message, I'm saving the score of each message on the message object in the graph, so I can retrieve it later. And lastly, to finish with the functions, here when I have get user, so this is my quote-unquote custom API that I built from Azure Functions. It triggers on HTTP trigger whenever somebody is sending a GET. And here, what it's going to do, it is going to request the last 10 messages, or the last, I don't know how many messages, I don't remember. For each of them, iterate on that and do an average. This is my very complex line of business logic. This is just to illustrate the purpose, but you could be imagining anything here. The way I get the context here is, remember how in SharePoint Framework, I have an API, custom API that is secured. Well, the SharePoint Framework is going to bake in an access token that is going to send as an authorization header in the request, and I'm going to get that on that end, basically, on that end. And I can use that access token to build my client, my graph client, and then talk to the graph normally as I would any other way. So that's on the Azure Functions. So labs, any advice on how to organize your functions production versus dev based on projects and so on and so forth? I'll get back to that question, Russell, at the time of conclusions, because I'm running a little bit out of time right now, but thank you. All right, so let's talk quickly about identity and authentication and authorization. The great thing about Office 365 or Microsoft 365 now is it has one central identity service, which is Azure Active Directory, which is the same identity service, by the way, which is leveraged by Azure, which makes a lot of things easier for us developers. It stores anything from users, groups, applications, application registrations to be exact, and so on and so forth. And it provides many capabilities from hybrid SSO federation to multi-factor authentication, geofencing, and also external collaboration capabilities, and so on and so forth. So this is a very really useful enterprise-grade identity service that Microsoft is providing. And the fact they're leveraging one single identity service for all the workloads they have aligned makes our lives much easier than in the past. The basics is, anytime you're building an app, whether you're building a phone application, a SharePoint Framework web part, any kind of web application, and so on and so forth, that app will have to contact Microsoft Identity Services, Azure Active Directory, to get either an ID token, an access token, or a refresh token. And then later on, it's going to provide that access token to the resource, which in our case is the Microsoft Graph, or our custom API, or a bunch of other things, to be able to authenticate and authorize against that resource. And so the resource know, yeah, this is a user we know, it's coming from an identity provider I trust, it has the proper permissions, and so on and so forth, and it granted those permissions, so it's okay for me to start providing data, and so on and so forth. I don't want to deep dive too much on that, and I'll be happy to stay later on the call if you have more questions. But basically, you have to understand some key concepts. That are you building an application first that you want to access as a user? So all the actions means that a user is using the application and I want to reflect that in my application. Whether you're using a single page application, building a single page application, a web app, a mobile app, or an API. And in that case, you are using permissions of type delegated, and that keyword is very important. And what you also have to keep in mind is that delegated permissions and a combination of the user, an intersection of the user privileges, are going to give you the effective permissions. So only because the user has access to his or her emails and that application requested the access to the emails, that you have access in the code that you're running to the emails. If the user doesn't have access to a certain mailbox, for example, if you're trying to access as user A via inbox of user B, you'll get an access denied. If your application didn't request any permissions for the mailbox, the mail.read, for example, but the user has access to the mailbox, you'll also get an access denied. So it's really important that when you want to reflect things as a user, you're using a context which is called a delegated context, and the effective permissions are an intersection of the permissions and the scopes you requested as an application and user privileges. So that's for accessing as a user. If now you want to access as a service for some kind of auditing service or some kind of service that's gonna check things, backup things, export things, whatever it is, right? That doesn't need any user interaction. Then you will be in an application context. So remember the terms: delegated context, application context. And in that case, the permissions should be the ones reflected by that you requested from the application. And those kind of contexts can only be granted by tenant administrators. So anytime you're building something that accesses as a service that doesn't reflect a user, it means that an admin is going to be required, a tenant admin to approve those requests and permissions. All right, so for the scopes and permissions, it's always going to look like the same structure for the graph, at least. You'll first begin by the resource, things like files, mail, groups, calendars, and so on and so forth. Then you will have a dot, then you'll have an action, read or write, and so on and so forth. And sometimes you will have a dot and a range. So .all, .shared, and so on. So for example, if I have user.read, that means I can read the current user. If I have directory.readwrite.all, that means I can, as an application, access the whole directory and do anything and everything I want pretty much on the directory. So this is a pretty broad permissions and so on. Now, in terms of SDKs and situation, we have a complex situation that Microsoft is working to solve. Basically, AAD, Azure Active Directory, has two endpoints, the V1 and the V2. That's easy so far. And those have different capabilities. V2, for example, has the capability of working with Microsoft account, things like Skype, Xbox Live, and so on, MSN, if you remember that, and so on and so forth. And V1 has capabilities that reach more to the enterprise. And Microsoft is working on bridging the gaps so the V2 endpoint can do anything and everything that the V1 can, but it's not here yet today. On top of that, you have two different SDKs just for the authentication and authorization purpose. One which is called MSAL, Microsoft Authentication Library, that talks to the V2, and one which is called ADAL, Azure Active Directory Authentication Library, that talks to the V1. And those SDKs can be used in different contexts, depending if you're doing .NET, .NET Core, if you're doing a web app, a client app, and so on and so forth. So it's a bit of a mess currently. And on top of that, depending on where you register your application, either on portal.azure.com or apps.dev.microsoft.com or portal.azure.com, but the preview version, it will register not different kind of apps because there are kind of all the same apps in the background, but different capabilities enabled applications that might impact what you're doing or not. So you have to be, my advice is to be really careful to read very well the documentation before you start any project to understand what you're trying to do, what capabilities you need to leverage to do that, what flows and authentication flows and context and so on and so forth you need for that, and then which endpoint and which library is going to be able to provide you with those capabilities and which portal you should use subsequently. Microsoft is working on, can I draw on this thing? No, hold on. Microsoft is working on simplifying the story, so removing that, have everything possible here. Make sure that this library, removing this library, making sure that this library can talk to whatever endpoint is required transparently for you, and hopefully at some point have the V2 endpoint being able to do everything that the V1 endpoint does. But today it's a bit complex and you need to read carefully the documentation. All right, I'm going to skip this one because I'm running out of time. Sorry about that. And let's talk about the Microsoft Graph. So what is the Microsoft Graph? And why should you care about that? So 90% of the Fortune 500 companies are using Office 365 or Microsoft 365 and have data exposed through the Microsoft Graph. What it means is we have today more than 135 million monthly active users. That doesn't mean they use everything and anything that is available in Office 365. It only means that they use maybe just emails or just SharePoint or maybe a combination of two, but that's a lot of users that you can reach out to. AAD or MSI treats or processes 1 billion authentication requests every month. So that's huge. Again, we have a lot of people that are available in more than 180 countries. And there is more than 1 billion meetings scheduled every month in Office 365. So effectively, the Microsoft Graph is a gateway API to everything which is a Microsoft service. Things like Office 365 with emails, calendars, SharePoint, you name it, OneDrive, and so on and so forth. Things like, can I use this thing, maybe? Use a pointer. Yeah, things like related to devices and security, like Windows 10, the policies, the history, the notifications, and so on and so forth. And things like enterprise mobility and security, think about Intune, deployment, policies, checking that the devices are healthy, and so on and so forth. So that API, the Microsoft Graph, is going to be a gateway to all those subsequent APIs that are available on Office 365 and Microsoft 365 at large. And through that gateway, you will be able to build any kind of applications, web application, device native applications, bots, and background processes, and more things than that. Let's talk about a typical user and the boundary between personal and professional accounts. So our user here, she has a professional account because she works in a company, and she, well, they are on Office 365, so she has access to an Azure Active Directory identity, Exchange, SharePoint Online, OneDrive, and so on and so forth, and more things like that. But she also has a personal life, hopefully, all right? And she has a Microsoft account with Outlook, the consumer version, OneDrive, a consumer version, To Do, OneNote, and so on and so forth. The great thing with the Microsoft Graph is more and more, it standardizes the API. You have the same exact API that behaves the same exact way between consumer products or services and professional services. So if you want to build a solution that, I don't know, is an expense report solution and that allows people to go through their OneDrives to find pictures that of receipts they might have clicked through, right, and upload those. Well, you need to write the code once, and it's going to work, and they can go through their personal OneDrive or their professional OneDrive to find those receipts and upload it to those to your system, right? And you can think about many other different scenarios. Another advantage of a graph is it is transversional and it's a wide API. So not only you have access to all those APIs, they made smart relationships between all the objects and entities. So if I go on the /me endpoint, I will have access to my organization, to the groups I'm part of, to the people I'm related to the teams I'm part of, and so on and so forth. And I can navigate in what I call walk the graph thanks to that. All right, let's move on. The basics, everything is going to be under graph.microsoft.com. Then you will have a version. Well, let's start with a verb. So it's a REST API, so it will respect the HTTP semantic. So you will use a get if you want to get data, read data, basically. You'll use a post if you want to create new data. You will use a patch or a put if you want to update data, and a delete to delete stuff. Once you have that in the URL, it's always going to have the same format. So first it's going to start with version. So you have today 2 versions available, well, publicly available at least. One which is V1. So that means it's production ready. You can go ahead, and if something breaks, Microsoft will fix it and support you for that, and they'll try to not to break it, basically. And you also have beta, so that's the new stuff that's coming up. It might change, break, not work at any moment, so don't complain if it's not working, and don't use it for production workloads, basically. Then you will have a resource, users, groups, sites, drive, and so on and so forth. Then you will have an ability in those resources collections to pinpoint a specific item or a specific entity by using, for example, usernames for the users, or IDs for emails, or IDs for calendars, and so on and so forth. And once you're on an entity, you can use transversional properties or navigation properties to kind of automatically navigate to those different entities that are related. For example, if I want the department that Jeff is part of, well, I can issue a query to graph.microsoft.com/v1/Jeff/department, and I'll get that automatically. Same thing for events and so on and so forth. And the other great thing is the endpoints implement OData capabilities, things like data projection with select, data ordering with order by, data filtering with filter, and so on and so forth. Right? You have SDKs today that are available because REST APIs are fun. Having a comprehensive SDK is better. And for the V1 endpoint today, you have 3 SDKs that are 5 SDKs that are generally available, that are JavaScript, TypeScript, .NET, PHP, and Java, and you also have Objective-C, which is, well, the iOS SDK, which is still in preview. So the SDK is in preview, but it's talking to the V1 endpoint. And for the beta endpoint, you have SDKs that are available that are PHP and TypeScript, and soon hopefully we'll have also .NET and Java to test out beta capabilities. So I already demoed how to call the graph in the functions. So I'm going to skip to the next part and then jump to the questions. The Microsoft Graph has a native, as I mentioned at the very beginning, has a native connector for Azure Functions that makes a lot of things easier. Today it's pretty limited, but it allows you to react on any kind of Excel document change. So you have a Excel binding and be able to you're able to write or read data from an Excel table automatically. You are able to also read and write to OneDrive automatically, and also have inputs and outputs to Outlook to be able to send emails or write to calendar and so on and so forth. And more importantly, you have the off token input binding, and this is the more important for me, because when you configure that, basically the function SDK will bake in the authentication for you, provide you with a token, and that token you can use for doing in order to do anything. You can use that token in the Graph client and then talk to anything which is not available here, basically, right? And lastly, you have an ability to register or to trigger webhooks. So things happen in the graph, they talk to your function, and you have right away the context available for you. So this is still in preview, but we're working on that, and this is looking great, and hopefully it will be a GA available, GA soon. So that's for the Azure Functions and the Microsoft Graph. For the SharePoint Framework and the Azure Functions, as I already demonstrated, you have the SharePoint Framework that helps you leveraging AAD applications with SharePoint Framework solutions. Basically, when I'm talking to my custom API, I'm leveraging an AAD application to do that. And it will bake in the authentication, get the tokens for you, get you a client ready to talk to your custom API. And yeah, that's well, that's not in preview anymore. I should have updated that slide. That's GA now. And the Azure Functions can be secured via the platform right away for you. So this is how the function is going to understand that I need to secure myself and the calls for via bearer token, and it will be able to reuse that bearer token to trade it out for a new token via the binding I was mentioning earlier, and to be able to talk to a Microsoft Graph. This is not what I want to do. So if I show you that real quick in the portal, because you need to see that, where is the portal? Here, if I go to, that's the wrong account, of course. Let me check this account. Here, I have way too many identities. Loading, dancing. All right, so if I go here, and hopefully with all my mess, I'll be able to find it quick. Maybe this one is good. So the way you can secure that Azure function super fast and super quickly is loading. Come on. Let me just go here. Here, so because it's again Azure functions are based off of Azure Web Apps, and that has easy auth already baked in. So you can just say, I want anybody that calls my function to have a token for that specific Azure the AD application with that secret and so on and so forth. Once you do that, the token input for the graph SDK for the Azure functions will be able to say, hey, there is a token. All right, I'm going to trade it in and get a token for the graph, because the token you got for that function was valid for your function, for this application, and your application has permissions on the graph, so it will do that automatically for you, right? So the only thing you need to do here is set this up, set up the on the SharePoint Framework what I showed to you, the scopes you need, and then on the function side, you just need to use the token binding here. It will trade that token automatically for you, basically. So that's really great. You just a couple of lines of code here and a couple of configuration, and you have all the authentication, authorization, dance baked in for you automatically. And with that, I will jump to the conclusion and answer any questions you might have. So we have endless possibilities. When you think about that power trio, because I like to call them a power trio, we have the capability of doing great looking front-end components with some line of business logic. And because the SharePoint Framework has and the Azure functions, they have those new capabilities, and they allow you to focus on the business value and the line of business code. It should lower development and integration costs for SharePoint and extensibility and so on and so forth, which means that altogether, you as developers have better productivity. It's easier to handle authentication and security. It's easier to handle scale and workloads. It's easier to do deployments. You focus only on your line of business code, and all of that is deeply integrated. So you care again about your line of business code. All that means is you will either save money for the company or help them make more money, because you help them implement more business value and automate more things. Usually when I need to convince my boss, I start by that argument, and then I go all the way up to explain why, because this is how I caught his attention, right? With that, sorry for going a little bit over. Thank you very much for attending the session. I hope you guys enjoyed the session. And if you have any questions, I'll stay online to answer those questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Vincent.
All right, so Russell had a question. Any advice on how you organize your functions, production versus dev, based on your project and so on and so forth? Usually, when I have, thank you, Mike. When I have functions, they don't come alone. They usually need some kind of storage or other service or any processing capability and so on and so forth. And I really want those to be isolated from production and dev and so on. And they might actually, because we're a consulting company, they might be on different subscriptions, right? So I try as much as I can to leverage different resource groups and have different resources, maybe not as big as production, right? Maybe smaller scale SKUs and scale units. But I try as much as possible, if I only have one subscription, to isolate them by resource group. And to have different services, like different instances all the time. So this way I can have CI/CD that targets the different environments, and I'm not risking, because I have different keys and connection strings, I'm not risking impacting production when I don't want to or anything like that, right? And often, again, those subscriptions are separated because we build things in our subscriptions at Tutorial, and then we give it to the customer. Also, if you do that, the great thing about that is you will be able to leverage ARM templates. ARM templates are descriptive templates that help you to say, hey, I need a function, I need storage, I need application insights, I need Redis caching, and so on and so forth. And that's going to provision all automatically for you, right? It's a kind of a way to template your service, what it needs and what underlying services it needs to run properly. So the way I do it, again, different resource groups that are templated with ARM templates, and I use that ARM template then to do my different services deployments to make things faster in my CI/CD. I have a question from, and I hope that answers your question, Russell. And thank you for the question. Navin, do you have any advice on how to address any performance and throttling concern? Throttling on which side? On the graph API, I guess, because this is the one I have had most issues with. In general. All right. So throttling is a cross-cutting concern, meaning that any API, usually today, most of our work as developers is to integrate APIs and to present it to the user, right? That's most of what we're doing today. And all those APIs are relying on limited physical resources, because at the end of the day, even though it's abstracted for us, it's running on physical hardware located somewhere that has limited capabilities in terms of storage, compute power, memory, or whatever it is, right? And to protect themselves from you guys as developers, what Microsoft or any API provider will do is they will throttle you depending on different concepts and different limitations, right? It's going to be calculated on a per user base, on a per application base, a combination of those two, and so on and so forth. What I'm trying to get to with that is any API you talk to will do throttling to you depending on different things and so on and so forth. So you need to be implementing different mechanisms to handle throttling, so your solution can either keep working or recover automatically from any throttling capability, a throttling event. You have different design patterns for that. One of those is the circuit breaker design pattern. The idea is on large workloads that are going to your system, you will see sometimes some of the APIs that you're reaching to be able to complete your business logic, throttling you up, right? That once that happens, you start stopping or degrading some features. So you stop hitting those APIs too much. So this way, they stop throttling you, and then you can resume that activity. It's basically a queuing dequeuing mechanism. This circuit breaker design pattern. Another way to do that is backup retry policies. So the way is like, hey, I just got a failure. Okay, I'm going to retry in 1 second, and then another failure because of throttling. I'm going to retry in 3 seconds, and so on, and display comprehensive messages to the user. The problem with that is if you take it on a large service on a large scale, if everybody tries, like if you get throttled for the whole application for all the users, and everything retries, you're just going to hammer more and more and more of the service that's throttling you in the first place, and the service is never going to recover from that, so it's never going to solve your situation. So my advice would be to implement some kind of secret breaker design pattern, and it doesn't need to be on the whole application. If you have different features talking to the same API, you can always say, let's say you have one feature, which is the live feature, which is a chatting whatever by email application, right? And you have another feature of your solution, which is a way to export or backup those chats or anything like that, right? Of course, the backupping or exporting one is going to be request heavy, and it's going to hammer the underlying API, and it's not the one where you make most of your money off, right? So it's okay to pause that feature temporarily, or to delay the processing until nighttime or whatever it is. So your core feature, which is the chatting one, will still be able to operate properly, right? So you can think of it these ways as well. But again, the only way to handle throttling properly is to back off in a certain manner and not retry right away, because again, on a large scale with multiple users, concurrent users, you're just going to hammer more of the service. So you need to disable some parts of your software at the end. I hope that answers your questions, Navin. And by the way, any good API should be telling you before they throttle you, we are going to be throttling you. So you should be looking at, for HTTP API and REST APIs, headers that will tell you that. Usually it's implemented through headers. Thank you, Navin.
Cool. So unless there's more questions, we're all good here. We don't have any more questions over here that I know about, but it was awesome. I actually learned some stuff about the Azure authentication tokens. That was cool. I had no idea about that. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
And I didn't remember to hit record, so that was good. So I will share out the video.
So you recorded everything. Good. That's good. Thank you.
Yeah. So very good. Well, thanks again, Vincent. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the pizza, and yeah, see you soon. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.